The end is upon us, the end of North American only players having to use quick servants in order to loop. Thanks to the introduction of Summer Meltryllis, North America gets a reasonably accessible, if you choose to roll the gacha, which you should, art servant that can loop quite respectably with the current supports we have available, and she only gets better once we have Castoria available to us. For a quick overview, Meltryllis is a 4-star Lancer with an attack stat of 9,261. If you foe her, it's 10,261. Her arts card is only 2 hits, but she has decent enough NP gain for that to not be too much of an issue, and her quick card is 4 hits, so she can actually generate quite a few stars if you ever have to use that. For her first skill, we see a 20% arts buff. At first glance, this may seem like a weak skill, but that is deceptive. At max level, this has a 4-turn cooldown, which means after the 3rd turn, you can double stack the effect for 40% arts up. It's essentially a glorified passive that on the 4th turn you can bump up to 40%. Her second skill is her defensive skill. It applies invincible for a turn and buff removal resist up to 100%, and it changes the field to water side. Now, invincibility and buff removal resist is an amazing combination. For example, if an enemy NP removes buffs, Meltryllis will be able to simply just tank the NP and take no damage. If it's AoE, that can also potentially kill her teammates, allowing new supports to come in. And finally, it changes the field type to water side, which would seem like a support option, except that Summer Meltryllis is the most selfish DPS you could ever have, so unfortunately you will not be using her with Nemo or Nero. And now on to her third skill, which is what makes Melt such an amazing looping servant. The skill absorbs NP charge from her allies, increases her star weight, and increases her attack for a single turn. At max rank, the charge is 30% per ally, which means she can absorb up to 60%. The catch is those allies have to have that charge. For example, if your 2 supports only have 20 charge each, Melt will only be able to absorb 40%. If they have 30% charge, they go to 0 and Melt gains 60. If they have 10% charge, they go to 0, Melt only gets 20. Aside from that though, it also does have an attack buff, which is 50%, which is not an insignificant amount. And finally, we have her Noble Phantasm, Blue's Summer Palladion, which when the field is water side, removes enemies' evasion buffs, it deals defense ignoring damage to all enemies, and she gains critical stars at the end of the turn. The amount of stars she gains does scale with overcharge. It's only a 3-hit NP, so it's nothing crazy, but thanks to Melt's inherently good NP gain and her 60% battery, she makes up for it. Also, thanks to her being able to place water side field at any time, she essentially has sure hit on her NP. The only time this does not work is when it is an unremovable buff. If the buff cannot be removed, she cannot remove it. That's what unremovable means. Her NP also ignores defense, so in challenge quests, you don't have to cart Sherlock around every single time. Moving over to CEs, there are 3 primary CEs that I would recommend, though you can make others work. The first CE is Kscope. This is the easiest to use if you have an MLB. You simply need Waver, Paracelsus, and the 2004 Mystic Code, and you can very easily loop on archers, even at NP1. You can do neutral damage at higher levels for things like Lancers, Casters, and you can also do Berserkers with this setup at higher NP levels. The second CE is IE, the one that starts at 75% charge. This one does require you to have Waver and Nero Bride, but if you have one and not the other, you can simply borrow a support. This one also does work at NP1. The final one is Magical Girl Sapphire. This one I feel is one of the more difficult ones to use as it does require higher NP levels. On top of that, you do also need to use the Babylonian Mystic Code in order to loop. Of course, in the future, none of these matter because we do get a one-size-fits-all solution.
Know your fucking place, trash!
Yes, enter Castoria and Black Grail. With double Castoria and a Black Grail, you can pretty much just loop anything, anytime, anywhere. If you want, you can even do Saber nodes with this if their HP isn't too high. With that overview done, let's move on to some examples of farming setups. We're going to show 2 NP1 setups and 2 Grailed NP5 setups. This first setup is about as scuffed as you can get, with a NP1 Melt with not even max skilled, using Waver and Nero Bride and the 2004 Mystic Code. This setup utilizes Nero Bride's NP gain increase in 2004 in order to maximize the amount of refund we get on the very first turn, which ends up being 60%. The only catch with this setup is either Nero Bride or Waver have to be in an arts chain, because this will end on turn 2 at 50% NP, and Waver's 2 skills only grant 20%, so you need another 10% from somewhere else. Other than that, this does work. Unfortunately, due to skills and NP level, this node does fall a little bit short in the damage department, but if you level your skills, this should not be an issue. This next one uses an NP1 Melt that is skilled this time, and the Painting Summer CE with the same setup of Nero Bride and Waver. Waver supplies 20% charge on turn 1, Nero 30%, and then the 2004 Mystic Code is used. Melt then ends at 72%. Waver then applies his 30%. Once again, this does need an arts chain in order to work. When you're dealing with NP1 like this and these CEs, you have to get an arts chain at least once. But otherwise, this one has a little bit more consistent damage thanks to the skills, and it will loop and it will farm archers. Here we have a run with a NP5 level 100 Melt using the Magical Girl Sapphire CE. This is using Paracelsus, Waver, and the Babylonia Mystic Code. This one does not require any arts chains, but the reason why I advise for high NP levels is because, as we see here, she enters turn 2 at 91%, which means if she is not getting as much overkill as possible in turn 1, she may fall short and you may not be able to loop. Enter turn 3 though, and Melt has no problem looping. She can pull in 40% from Waver and Paracelsus, or Paracelsus can use his first skill in order for Melt to pull in 50%. For the final example, we have Melt with a MLB Kscope and the 2004 Mystic Code. This is the ideal setup in my opinion, as it can be used to farm anything including Berserkers. The skills used this run don't really change much from the previous Waver and Paracelsus runs. The important thing to note though is when you are using this setup to farm Berserkers, you have to use the 2004 buff on turn 1. For farming archers or neutral damage, you can actually save it to turn 2 and use it, but for Berserkers you do have to use it turn 1, which is why I demonstrated it as such here. When you enter turn 3, against anything but Berserkers, you will be over 60%, so you don't need to use Paracelsus' first skill, but against Berserkers, you will need to use that in order for Melt to absorb 50% and finish the node. So in conclusion, Melt best Lancer, arts meta forever, I'm done with Quick, never again will I use Scotty.